everyone. My name is Insia, and I will be moderating today's discussion on 200 days of genocide in Gaza. We have an extremely distinguished group of panelists with us who will be speaking to us about Gaza today. And the focus will, of course, be on many of the Palestinian prisoners in Gaza who were arrested, who were tortured following their arrest. But we'll also be looking at, and we'll be hearing from some of our speakers about displacement in Gaza since October 7th, which has been a huge issue. Many people have been displaced multiple times and have gone back to completely destroyed homes, so permanently displaced as well. This is, of course, a very grim anniversary of 200 days in which now it suggests it's over 34,000 people have been killed, and the number seems to be quite a conservative estimate. And so first, I would really like to begin our discussion today with Dr. David Monnier, who is the co-director of UJCI and international relations and foreign policy expert. Dr. Monnier.
Good evening. I would like to start by saying that the situation in Gaza, for someone speaking from South Africa, is not far-fetched from events in apartheid South Africa. As we reach the 200 days, we have seen the massive impact this has had on the people in Gaza, on the family, displacement of people, a massive killing, 33,000 plus more are still buried under the rubbles, and massive displacement of people. And that kind of atrocities committed, for me, speaks to a number of other issues that perhaps this is a golden moment to pose the questions. What are the implications of what's happening in Gaza? It is no longer a localized conflict as Palestinian and Israeli. I think we have seen the implication it has in the greater Middle East and globally. And bigger questions that we are grappling with is precisely have to do with the global institutions of governance. The implication this is having on the international humanitarian law, on human rights, and more importantly, on the question of democracy. And to what extent will the international community, the positive implication, I think, that we have seen, I think since the end of apartheid, we've seen the resurgence of solidarity movements across the globe, unprecedented solidarity towards people in Gaza. And we are also pleased to see that the solidarity, it's not based on race or religion. It's based on humanity, that bulk majority of people all over the world are opposed to what is happening. We also have seen attempts by South Africa and joined by a number of countries all over the world, challenging the status quo using existing institutions and the judiciary at a global level to challenge what is happening. And we are awaiting the outcome of this. It will take time. However, I think the greatest achievement has been registered, that there are potential, there is ongoing the possibility of a genocide. I do not think that the world should wait for the final pronouncement. We see the advantage of technology is bringing us much closer to events on the ground. We see those rubbles, we see dead children, we see prisoners, we see bodies, and recently we just have seen bodies coming from a hospital. These are signs of a genocide, and we really do not need to be more academic about it. And therefore, in my own view, that this is also bringing us much more closer as the world against a minority of most powerful countries. Countries, particularly United States and few countries within EU and Britain, that tend not to see the world the way we do. That the entire international system of governance, the UN itself, it's showing signs of having run its course. The need for reforms, not just on the question of representation, but more fundamentally so on the application of international law. And I think this is the time to call upon the international community, those who are demonstrating all over the world, to register their view, and with only one view, that the world is not against Jewish people. I think the world is against the Jewish state that is committing atrocity. And for that, we stand for the rights of Palestinians as much as the Israelis living side by side, two states solution to this, to end the atrocities. And those atrocities need to end now. Free prisoners in both parties, Israeli prisoners, as well as massive number of prisoners in Israel prisons, and violation of human rights. There are rules that govern holding prisoners, and therefore I think we call on international community, and both Israelis as well as Palestinian, those who are holding prisoners, to remember that the world is watching, and we need to abide by international law in all what we do. I'll pause for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monnier. I would like to invite next to speak to us a former British diplomat, Craig Murray. Sir, he will be joining us next. Sir, please.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed that introductory talk by Professor David. And I agreed, I think, with everything he said, up until he said a two-state solution, when I didn't agree with him. And I may talk about that in a moment. But his analysis is absolutely correct, that there is a crisis in Western democracy, which goes well beyond the issue of the terrible genocide we are witnessing in Gaza, but which the genocide in Gaza has brought into sharp relief and made people notice in a way many people hadn't noticed before. And that is that, and to give the United Kingdom as an example, a very large majority of the population are against the actions of the Israeli government in Gaza. The last time I saw an opinion poll on the subject, I think it is 71% were against what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza. 12% were in favor and 17% didn't know. But that's like 6-1 of people who have an opinion are against. And yet, at the next general election, which is coming up shortly, the main political party and the main opposition party are both absolutely committed to the support of Israel, absolutely committed to Zionism, absolutely committed to continuing weapons sales to Israel. And until recently, when they half changed in a very hedged way, the Labour Party even opposed a ceasefire again and again. So you don't have a chance to vote for one of the main political parties who may become the government, who may reflect your opinion. Democracy only is democracy if there's a real choice, not just of different candidates, but of different policies, where the outcome of an election will lead to different policies. And unfortunately, the political class as a whole, both government and opposition across the Western democracies, has been absolutely captured by the Zionist lobby, and does not represent the people at all. And it goes much wider than Gaza, because, for example, a large majority, very large majority of people throughout the United Kingdom believe, for example, that water supply should be nationalized. It should not be in private hands, because it's been a disaster putting it in private hands. Yet you cannot vote for any political party which is going to nationalize the water supply, even though everybody wants to. And you effectively have a chance of voting for, your choice is to vote for two conservative parties, the Red Conservative Party or the Blue Conservative Party. And that's no different. If you're in the United States, you have the choice between voting for the extreme Zionist Donald Trump or the extreme Zionist Joe Biden. And that is the choice. They are minor candidates, but they're not going to be elected. So Gaza has pointed out this crisis of democracy. Of course, in Gaza itself, we have a crisis of genocide. And I mean, there is no doubt it's a crisis of genocide for all the reasons Professor David outlined. And there's no point in me repeating what he said. But I would add to that just two thoughts. The first thought is the percentage of children killed is a very clear indicator of genocide. If you look, for example, at the war in Ukraine currently, the percentage of those killed in the Ukrainian war who have been children is approximately 7%. And that, I mean, war is terrible. War is not normal in itself. But about 7% of those killed being children is a normal kind of statistic for a war. It's generally around that, generally less than 10%. In Gaza, 40% of those killed are children. And that's a clear sign. This is not a war. This is a genocide. But anyway, how could it be a war? When you are fighting, you have one side which has United States supplied the most advanced military equipment in the world, fighting against a people who have no army, no air force, and no navy. How can that be a war? It's not a war. And if it's not a war, what is it? It is a massacre. It is a genocide. And let us not be in any doubt about that. And finally, and I do apologize, I can't stay for the discussion. I'm in Pakistan at present, and it's after 9 o'clock at night yet, and I'm supposed to be at an official dinner, which I need to get myself to. But the final point I wanted to make is I don't see a two-state solution. I agree absolutely. I mean, I see Israel as an apartheid state. I used to be the head of the South Africa desk in the Foreign Office many years ago, back in the 1980s, when I was a young diplomat. And I see many very real parallels between South Africa and what Israel is doing, both in the racially based legislation of, massively complex, hundreds of laws discriminating between Jews and Arabs, but also I see the two-state solution as a Bantustan solution, because what they propose to be the Palestinian state is not actually a single state at all. It is a number of small, fractured, disconnected pieces of land, which could never be a viable economic entity and could certainly be never be a viable defensive entity. And they actually state that, the Israeli state will be armed to the teeth, and the Palestinian state, those who propose a Palestinian state, say it will be demilitarized and won't be not allowed to have armed forces. And that's a crazy idea. When the Israeli state is proven to be genocidal towards the Palestinians, the idea that the Palestinians should be disarmed alongside them, this is not a solution. And one final comparison with South Africa, which I'm keen to make because it's very important. When in the 1980s I was working on South Africa, the white South Africans who supported apartheid, they always said, and they actually believed, they genuinely believed, that majority rule in South Africa was impossible because they would all be killed. They said the black people will kill us. We will be murdered in our beds. The white population will be massacred and die, which is exactly why the Israelis say a one-state solution is not possible in Palestine. They say if we don't have a separate Jewish state, a racially based Jewish state, we will all be massacred and die. Well, it's not true at all. You know, the black South Africans never had any desire to massacre all the white South Africans, and the Palestinians have no desire to massacre all the Israeli Jews. So, we shouldn't be swayed by these nonsensical arguments. The only solution for me in the long term is a single state of Palestine, which is democratic and blind to race. And I think that's all I wanted to contribute. And I do apologize. I can't stay around because I would have loved to stay and discuss this further.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time. It was really great to hear from you and bring forward the argument about the one state and two state solution, which tends to be quite a hotly debated issue, I think. I would like to invite next to join us Ken Roth, who is an attorney, human rights activist, and writer. Unfortunately, it seems that Mr. Roth also has some time commitments. So I would just like to invite you to speak next, please.
Okay, well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you. Let me, if I could, run through fairly quickly the nature of the war crimes and also a bit on the genocide, and then say a word about the international response. Now, there's been a lot written about Israeli war crimes in Gaza. What I'd like to focus on is the Israeli claim that, oh, it's just Hamas who targets civilians. We don't do that. We take care to spare civilians. And, it's been very difficult to test that proposition because they don't allow journalists, international journalists, they don't allow human rights defenders on the ground to do investigations. So we have to monitor remotely as best we can. But it is, more and more information is coming out. And what we're learning is that this fine distinction between Israel and Hamas breaks down in many respects, and not simply in the death toll. So just, to give a few examples, international humanitarian law protects civilian structures. You're not supposed to attack them unless they're being used for military purposes. But what we've seen is that over and over, the Israeli military has deliberately destroyed universities, large apartment buildings, things that they call power targets, where their point is not to strike a military target. These are often controlled demolitions. Nobody's there. But rather, this is an effort to demoralize Palestinian civil society as a way to put pressure on Hamas. Now, the one problem with that as a negotiating strategy is it's a war crime. You're not allowed to do that. You cannot use military force, the purpose of which is just to demoralize the civilian population. You can't use military force to destroy civilian structures. But we're seeing this, not just around civilian structures, but also around civilians, around people. And, there's been much written about the recent attack on the World Central Kitchen staff that killed 7 workers. And, that got a lot of attention because 6 of them were internationals. What I think is interesting, though, is what it shows us about the rules of engagement that Israeli forces are following. Because even if you take the Israelis at their word, they say, we didn't know that these were, staff of World Central Kitchen. We didn't know they were delivering food, even though these were the convoy that had just left the food warehouse. But let's take them at their word. What they say, what they justify here, the attack on, is, somebody thought that they saw a gunman get on one of the 3 vehicles. This fleeting glimpse. Now, could that have been a security guard? We have no idea whether that was Hamas. But that fleeting glimpse was sufficient under the rules of engagement that were operating at the time to deliberately track down all 3 of those vehicles, which are at some distance from each other, and kill all 7 people in them. So, what does this say about what civilians are facing day in and day out in Gaza? Another variation on this theme is that we're now learning more and more. There's this Israeli, excellent media outlet called 972, plus 972 after the zip code, or the country code. And it found that, not only is Israel using artificial intelligence for much of its targeting with very little human review, just a presumption of correctness, but that it actually prefers targeting, even low-level Hamas operatives in their family home. It's easier to find them there. Of course, who else lives in a family home? Their family. They just bomb it anyway. And while, Israel says, oh, we have lawyers reviewing everything we do. In fact, what 972 has found is that the lawyers are approving, even for low-level Hamas operatives, a combatant to non-combatant death toll of 1 to 15 or 1 to 20. This completely rips up the rules of proportionality. This is, the opposite of what humanitarian law prescribes. And of course, we're seeing, other elements of that. If you look at, how is Israel going after the Hamas tunnels? Not with, precision bombs that would, target the entrances or minimize civilian damage. They've been using these massive 2,000-pound bombs that are designed to decimate neighborhoods. So it's like, oh, we think there's a tunnel down there. Let's just, pulverize the neighborhood and hope we destroy the tunnel. But in the process, we kill everybody who's there. And this again just shows this indifference to civilian life. Similarly, nearly half of the bombs that are being dropped are dumb bombs, unguided bombs. Not the precision guided bombs that Israel has in its inventory, but just dumb bombs that, of course, are more likely to miss their target. Therefore, you need a larger bomb, which has more collateral consequences. And this again just shows this kind of indifference for civilian life. Another war crime, very different in nature, is the deprivation of food, medical necessities, and the like. And humanitarian law requires warring parties to allow access to humanitarian aid for a civilian population in need. And Israel's basically ripped up that rule too. They allow in drips and drabs of aid, so there's not, widespread death by starvation, but there is widespread hunger, widespread starvation. And as Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, said, there's actually famine in parts of northern Gaza. So this is, a deliberate starvation strategy, part of how Israel's negotiating with Hamas, again, a war crime strategy. And while Israel loves to blame everybody else, and it's the NGOs that are not delivering the aid or whatever, first of all, they've tried to destroy UNRWA, which is the best organization by far to deliver aid within Gaza. They want rid of UNRWA because they feel if they get rid of UNRWA, they can somehow solve the problem of Palestinian refugees, naively. But also, when they're under sufficient pressure, when, Biden calls up Netanyahu and says, if you don't let in more food, look out, we're going to condition our aid, suddenly more food gets in, which shows that Israel's, calibrating what it lets in. It really, underscores the Israeli control. So these are all, kind of the basic war crimes that what Hamas did on October 7th, was a war crime. But what Israel is doing since then is a war crime after war crime after war. Now, one quick word about genocide, because much of what I've described here does involve the large-scale killing of civilians, the creation of conditions that make, life unlivable, that jeopardize the lives of civilians. These are among the requisite acts of genocide. And if you look, for example, the most prominent, recent ruling of genocide was in the case of Srebrenica in Bosnia, where 7,000 to 8,000 men were killed. Compare that with, today the health ministry has said 34,000 have been killed. Let's very conservatively say 20,000 of those are civilians. So, that's a number that is plenty large enough to constitute the act element of genocide. But what this is really going to come down to is, can those who are seeking to call it genocide, say South Africa in the case before the International Court of Justice, can they demonstrate genocidal intent? The intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, religious, national, or ethnic group as such. And I had a piece today, actually, in the Boston Globe that talks about the International Court of Justice's very conservative jurisprudence on inferring intent from conduct on the ground. So the South African case is built in part around statements of Israeli officials. President Herzog, who basically said there are no uninvolved civilians, Defense Minister Gallant, who called people human animals. Some people said, oh, he just meant Hamas, but he was talking about the siege. So he really meant everybody who's subject to the siege. So those are clear, statements, direct evidence of intent. But the court is not going to probably find genocidal intent unless it can draw inferences from the conduct on the ground. And it has very conservative jurisprudence in this area because it ruled in the case of Croatia versus Serbia that you cannot infer genocidal intent unless it's the only inference from the acts on the ground. And there it found because Serbia was also trying to ethnically cleanse, it was also trying to forcibly displace Bosnian, Croatians in that case. Therefore, it wasn't the only purpose, and that was a defense to the inference of genocidal intent. And obviously, in the case of Gaza, you could say the same thing. You've got people like, the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, who have been very open about saying, let's, destroy Gaza and force people to voluntarily leave. And there's this element of mass forced displacement as a way of dealing with the demographic problem of having roughly the same number of Palestinians and Jews between the river and the sea. I worry that if the International Court of Justice sticks with its ultra-conservative jurisprudence, that it will say, well, there's forced displacement here. That's a war crime, but that becomes a defense to the inference of genocidal intent. Now, that's crazy, but that is what their jurisprudence currently says. So I hope that this is an opportunity for them to reconsider their jurisprudence. One last point on the state question. I mean, I still think the best solution is a two-state solution, but we should recognize that, the massive expansion of settlements and outposts and bypass roads have basically chopped up the West Bank into something that looks like Swiss cheese. I think it was B'Tselem that counted like 160 different enclaves. It's virtually impossible at this stage to envision a contiguous, viable state there. Now, theoretically, they could pull back a whole bunch of settlements or tell settlers, you have a choice. If you want to stay there, then you're going to be citizens of Palestine. But, the current government is dead set against that. It would take a real switch in Israeli politics for that to be possible. So then, what are the options? The options are, a one-state reality, recognition of that, with equal rights for everybody. South Africa does provide a precedent for that. That's the last thing the Israeli government wants. There is ongoing apartheid, which I think is, going to be increasingly difficult for the defenders of the Israeli government to explain, because the excuse has always been, oh, well, there may be systematic discrimination, but it's temporary. Don't worry about it. The peace process will take care of that. But, there is no peace process. And then, the final solution, which the far-right ministers want, is mass expulsion. You deal with the demographic issue by just getting rid of the Palestinians. And so those are the, ugly choices we face. And, given that, I still think that either equal rights within a single state or a two-state solution are by far the best choices. And it's going to really come down to, what is it possible for the Israeli government to accept? And at some point we'll get beyond Netanyahu, whose strategy is just endlessly kick the can down the road and pretend it's not apartheid. But, hopefully we get some more enlightened Israeli government that recognizes the need for a different approach.
Thank you so much. That was really great and extraordinarily insightful. I would like to invite next to speak to us Ibo Mendaza, who is an academic author and advisory council member at FPRI. So if you would like to speak next.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important discussion. I want to begin by saying that we also belong to an organization called Suppress Trust. It's been very busy ever since 7th October in highlighting the tragedy of Gaza and the whole Palestinian question. A few weeks ago, we also held a webinar on this subject. how to stop the genocide immediately, and how to end the occupation. We're grateful, really, that in the era of social media and the existence of Al Jazeera, the events since 7th October have been graphically broadcast to the world. And I would like to say that whilst most of us in the South are well mobilized in support of the Palestinians, it's also fair to say that most of the public opinion in the West whose governments support Israel, the USA in particular, but also the UK and the EU in general, the public opinion has registered its support for the Palestinians in a big way. Thousands, the other day, 300,000 in London in demonstration, New York, all over the world. So we have to say that the Western governments themselves are at odds, as someone said earlier on, Craig, at odds with their own populations. And the disgraceful situation in which you find both the Tories and the Labour Party, I remain in support of Israel, in spite of the fact that 71% of the population are opposed to what's going on in Gaza and in Palestine as a whole. Thirdly, I'd like to say that historically, what has happened over the last 6 months, 200 days, will have changed the trajectory of history enormously. From a point where the pace of change has been determined more at the behest of the Israeli state, the Zionist state, and its sponsors in the West, to a position where the rest of the world now, and including the populations, as I've already mentioned, are now clearly more conscious of the Palestinian question. That's very clear. And I would like to say that historically, we have reached a turning point towards a resolution of the Palestinian question, albeit on the back of genocide, the worst genocide in recent history. And the action by the South African government to take the matter to the ICJ was important and represents that turning point. And I agree with Craig, it's no longer about a two-state solution, if also because the Israeli state itself has since killed that idea by virtue of this genocide, but also in terms of the extension of the settlements across most of Palestine. And I think that we must acknowledge, and we want here to acknowledge, that what we have in Palestine is a colonial question, no different from the apartheid question in South Africa. And we should remember, hardly 40, 50 years ago, the Western world, again, the governments were supporting apartheid South Africa and wanted to almost turn back the clock of decolonization. And I repeat, what is happening now, albeit at the expense of so many lives, over 40,000 people, 40% of my children, is nevertheless the turning point towards the resolution of the Palestinian question in terms of a Palestinian independence, Palestinian freedom, in which all Arab and Israelis, Arabs and Jews can live in the country the same way that today in South Africa, black and white live in the same country as equal citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mandaza. I would really like to invite next Ms. Elliot Shwe, who is in fact an organizer with Columbia University Apartheid Divest and has been part of what has been the sit-ins. So please, Ms. Elliot, it would be great to hear from you.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I just want to speak on the situation really across the United States, across college campuses, and the expression of the masses across the globe. We are seeing that majority of the world, global consensus, is that this is genocide. This is apartheid. This is occupation. This is settler colonialism. And what we're seeing here is the most repressive elements coming out of administration, out of governments, and especially out of Israel. However, this is a sign of the weakness, of the pressure, of the crumbling, this lack of integrity, disunity, even within administrations, even within governments, even within the most, one of the most racist states in the world. We're seeing calls for change within a state, within institutions. And so when we see over 100 students arrested, called on by their own president, we're seeing that specifically in Manu Shafiq, she is trembling, she does not know what to do, and she clearly has regretted this calling for arrest. And so we as students, we are calling across the globe, we're calling across the United States, all students, all professors, all people across sectors, across industries, to leverage whatever title they hold, whether that be student, whether that be software developer, whether that be a social worker, whether that be a lawyer, to really leverage whatever they have to point all eyes on Gaza, and really put pressure on those who are in power. And when we see liberation movements across the globe, across time and history, we see the agents of that history are not the people in power officially, but are the masses, are the people who demand justice, who demand a removal of occupation. And so what we're seeing here in Columbia's campus is that mass support, even those who weren't initially involved in these demonstrations, they spontaneously came up after these arrests, these mass arrests. People jumping fences to occupy another space, to set up encampments, to demand that what we're seeing by Columbia administration is not reflective of the students. And we are making that clear. And so when we're bringing on professors, we're bringing on academics, when we're bringing on experts, I just want to make clear to the people that we are orienting these experts, these theories, these facts, not to be used in heady, nebulous capacities, but to be mobilized by the people in action, in practice. And so the most education one can do, the most education one can receive is not simply by the books, but by organizing, by getting together, reaching out to your community, building that trust, building these communities, not for the sake of community, but for a greater cause, for greater virtues that we all have been taught by our lineages, by our ancestry. And so that is what Columbia students, that is what all students across the United States, it's calling people because we know that Palestine is for Arabs. Palestine is an Arab region. So we ask the question, why are white European settlers, American, United States settlers coming into this land that have no ties? We know that Palestinians are indigenous to this land. and we cannot let settlers come on and allow state violence to enforce this colonization.
Thank you so much. That was really, really great. And we wish you all the best of luck with the continued sit-ins at Columbia. I would like to invite next with us a scholar, in fact, Orub Al-Abid, who is the lead researcher in Jordan and co-investigator at the Center for Lebanese Studies. Ma'am, welcome.
Thank you. Well, over the last 76 years, sadly, Israelis have been leading their master plan of transfer. This plan of transfer has been aiming to dispossess historical Palestine from its original people, continuing to expand its Zionist Israeli state. The Zionist policy of transfer over the years have ensured to erase villages, kill civilians, target young Palestinians, and oblige people to leave their homes and towns through psychological warfare and committing massacres. Transfer also includes cutting water and food supplies, as well as undermining or destructing the economic infrastructure. This is how Ilan Pappé depicted the ethnic cleansing of Palestine executed by the Zionist Israelis since 1948. Today, we are in 2024. We're seeing the very exact scenario. We're seeing it, at least. In the old days, we were reading it in the archives. We're seeing it, and we're seeing even execution of mass graves, and we're seeing beheaded corpses, which was found 2 days ago in one of the hospitals. And the continuum of the Zionist transfer plan does not stop, and no one is able to stop it. The genocide is not only limited to this kind of act, but it also encompasses killing the providers of medical services, because they want to make sure whoever is attacked is not really, or whoever is injured is not really able to get any kind of medical care. It also encompasses the killing for media people. They do not want to reveal the reality. They do not want anyone to talk about the acts that they are doing on the ground against the Palestinian nation that owns the land. Sadly, this was not only limited to genocides and killing, but also it exceeds the limit to go far to attacking the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the body that for the Palestinians represents the entity that takes care of their humanitarian well-being, but also it represents their Palestinian refugee identity. They managed successfully to convince the world, major countries of the world, that the humanitarian employees of UNRWA are terrorists and they are acting on the ground against Israel, which is not at all a true story. And it took many countries to investigate that and to prove the big lie of the Zionists. The image of the prisoners, today we're talking about over 9,000 prisoners. The image of them being taken away from their cities and from their families is very much of a recreation of the image that we all saw of the imprisonment of the Jews themselves in the 40s by Hitler, as if this kind of history being repeated in order for these oppressed people to repeat the kind of torture they endured themselves. How inferior this is. We're coming today to, before I move on to what we are in, when we're talking about Rafah, it's important also to remind that all these 9,000 prisoners We are very well aware of the kind of torture they are enduring. Few of those who are being let out are telling us stories to the media about the way that they have been treated and the kind of effect, the insults against their dignity that has been executed by the Zionist Israelis. Sadly, today we stop watch over 1.5 million Palestinians stranded in a very tiny space like Rafah, awaiting to be shelled and trying to make their decisions. Now, differently to what happened over the 75 years when people really were seeking safe haven outside the land of Palestine, this time the Gazans are representing for us the real adamant position of not wanting to leave their land. They are the owners of the land and they want to remain in the land. And by remaining in the land, they're saying that if you want to shell Rafah, we want to die in Rafah, or we need to go back to our Gaza. That we saw a few days ago, a good number of Palestinians from Rafah started going up to the north of Gaza. So that tells us something. They have learned their lessons that the land cannot be left, because if they don't stay and fight for it, no one will safeguard them. No one will come and save them. Sadly, we continue to read about the possibility for these Palestinians to go to Egypt and how possible this would be if they manage to go to Egypt and if Egypt will accept letting them in. I believe messages have been quite loud by both the Egyptian authorities and Jordanian authorities that the whole idea of receiving more refugees will not be accepted. And the Palestinians are welcoming such kind of messages because they want to remain in their land against such kind of atrocious state of Zionism, the undermining and belittling the humanity of Palestinians, the people who own the land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Speaking to us next will be Richard Falk, who is a professor, activist, and human rights defender. It is incredible to be able to hear from you, Sam.
Did you just introduce me? I just not able to get on.
Yes, absolutely. I did. If you would like to speak to us.
Okay. Yes, well, I'm honored to take part in this remembrance of the tragic ordeal that has befallen the technical problem, right? Sorry. Let me begin again. Oh, I still can't get
Good. We can hear you clearly now.
I don't know. Okay, I think I solved it. Sorry. Let me say again that it is a great privilege to take part in this event, which tries to give a focus to the ordeal that has befallen the Palestinian people over the last 200 days. As earlier speakers have indicated, this is the most transparent genocide of all history that has exposed the peoples of the world to the atrocities that constitute the substance of the crime in real time. In the past genocides have been known only through the reconstruction of past events, through official reports, film, and survivor memoirs, but never as they occurred have people been exposed to the imagery of genocide and the outspoken endorsement of it by those who are guilty of its commission. Beyond that, this may be one of the first genocides which is a functional genocide. In other words, it's not just motivated by the dehumanization of the Palestinian people or hatred for them as was exhibited in the Holocaust. It's part of the Zionist project to empty historic Palestine of the people whose homeland it was. In other words, it's a forced evacuation of people from their own homeland. And to do this is being done partly because of the failures of apartheid to keep control over resistance activities by the Palestinians, but principally to carry forward the agenda of this Netanyahu extremist coalition, which really came to power with the vision of completing the Zionist project by establishing Greater Israel, which was assumed to extend Israeli sovereignty beyond the unlawful incorporation of East Jerusalem to the West Bank. Gaza had previously not been seen as part of the Promised Land, and that probably changed with the discovery of oil and gas off the coast, and through the idea that seems to animate Israeli governmental thinkers of establishing a Ben Gurion Canal that runs through part of Gaza and would provide an alternative to the Suez Canal. So Gaza has changed from being a burden, an economic burden, and a political bargaining chip that Israel would have earlier given to a federated country with Jordan, but now sees as something that it wants for its own territorial expansionist purposes. This kind of exploitative functional genocide is understood as such by the greater majority of countries and peoples of the world. But we have to remember that in the liberal democracies of the West, this imagery has been filtered by self-censorship and manipulation of the media by governments and all kinds of actions that distort the news. We have the report of the leaked testimony about the New York Times telling its journalists in Gaza not to use the words genocide or ethnic cleansing or even occupied territory. And that's all part of an idea of trying to maximize the effectiveness of saying Israel can defend itself against October 7th, and what it's doing by defending itself is compatible with international law and international norms. That's a completely misleading narrative, but it's one that is being sold to many people in the liberal democracies. And a final point that I would make is that it is the first time that liberal democracies have not only sat on the sidelines while genocide is committed, but been actively complicit in its implementation. It is a shocking reality, and it suggests the primacy of a racialized view of the conflict. It's what I've called in the past the second coming of Samuel Huntington's ideas about a clash of civilizations. Because if you notice, the countries that support Israel are the former European colonial powers, UK, France, Germany, and the breakaway British colonies of North America, Australia, New Zealand. In other words, the white West against the rest, which was the Huntington thesis. And what the recent attack in Iran showed, when the Arab governments, the Sunni Arab governments, entered the conflict, was a secondary level of conflict, which showed that the Sunni Arab countries allied themselves with Israel against Iran in a sectarian struggle between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. So we have a intercivilizational conflict being surrounding the violence that is perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people, and is at its core a genocide that has been insulated from accountability at the International Court of Justice, at the Security Council, by the UN. And the US has shown that it cares not a bit about international law and international morality when it conflicts with its strategic interests overseas. So we're confronted by a great challenge to our morality, and we're dependent on the activism of civil society to seize this opportunity to exert pressure on governments and institutions to stop this genocide as a matter of urgency for the future of humanity. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Sir. That was really, really great to hear, and your analysis. I would like to invite next to speak with us Yo Insarko, who is an author and political scientist. Are you with us?
Well, thank you very much. I was just unmuting and wondering what more to say after all of these heavyweight resources have spoken. I think the subject has been covered fairly significantly and fairly comprehensively, and I do not therefore want to rehash points that have been made. The only element that I would wish to add to this is that while the proximate analysis, in my view, has teased out all the factors, if I listen to everyone who spoke, they sometimes didn't agree on two-state solution, one state, but essentially they have covered all the ground. However, it is always important for us to step back and realize that at the end of the day, what we are speaking about is a manifestation of hegemony. And the main reason why we are in this place is it will sometimes be in South Africa, sometimes be in Israel, whatever. But the main reason why we are in this place is that we have not been able to tame a hegemonic power, which is willing, especially since 1945, to use all methods possible to prosecute its agenda. And the drive for hegemony is not just a drive for empire. It is following a logic of that wherever capital finds itself, as Walter Rodney put it, it seeks domination. And in order to be able to seek domination, it must expand empire. So that is the element that I would like to add, because whatever is done, we must remember those structural forces are in place. And if we do not step back and look at this in the context of the interstate power struggle for global domination and world hegemony, we will always deal with the symptom, but the fundamental causes will remain. Beyond that, I don't wish to add much more. I think that the issues have been plumbed in deep detail, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for that short but really great intervention. I would like to invite next. I know we're a bit over time, but we have just an absolutely fabulous panel of speakers who are still remaining, and I would request everyone to follow on. We will be hearing next from Naomi Barasa, who is a social justice activist.
Thank you so much. I beg not to be on camera because I have challenged connection. And thank you so much for inviting me to this forum. And thank you to all the speakers who have powerfully presented the issues. I just wanted to focus a bit on water. It's exactly 1 month since World Water Day. And my subject for this conversation today would be water and how Israel continues to use water as a weapon of war and oppression for the Palestinians. The Israeli government has very strategically developed used water as a strategy to exterminate Palestinians. And it's clear, it's very clear from how they've been blocking and denying Palestinians water as an essential strategy to the war. When you look at what Palestinians, right from when the occupation started and when it intensified, the 1.5 liter per day that Palestinians have been accessing by itself is a human rights violation. But even now, even that is today a big luxury because they do not have water at all this time round. And the strategy is very systematic and targeted. And when you look at how the Israeli government has been doing it, you'll clearly see that this is a tool for oppression. One, it started by reducing the accepted quantity and quality of water. Then it added blocking of access to, water, safe, clean, and safe water, drinking water. And then it got to a point it's contaminating water that is accessible by the Palestinians. And then it cut supply and now redirecting and drying River Jordan and the Red Sea. When you look at all this, for me, are very clear conditions that are targeted at exterminating a community as part of their ethnic cleansing agenda. And the strategy for me is a tool of apartheid, colonization, and genocide, and which is achieving exactly what they have intended to. And my question today is to the wider water bodies in the world. We have the UN and all water bodies that talk about water. Today, the World Forum, Water Forum was meeting. And the Palestinians' access to water is not part of the agenda for the day, simply because it is one of the weapons. So as we talk about bombs, we know that today Palestinians are more threatened by starvation to death than they are threatened by the bombing that is happening, that has already killed over 37,000 people. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the solution to the water problem must not be looked in isolation. It must be looked in totality as the occupation, as the apartheid question. And finally, my thinking about what solution is taken for the occupation. In my opinion, the solution must be based on the wishes of the Palestinians, because especially as an African, as a Kenyan who lived in a former colony state of colonizers, I wouldn't have wished to see my colonizers remain, because the whole world is thinking that where will they go? So it would have only been fair for Kenyans to say, we are happy to remain with them and stay with them. But if Kenyans wish to expel them completely, then that should be respected, because these are occupiers, these are colonizers, and they are settlers, occupiers. So it shouldn't be two states, two world war. Let the Palestinians say what they want. If they want to expel them, for me, it should be okay, because this is their land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. That was really interesting, especially to hear about water being used as a weapon of war. And I would like to move next to Cyprian Nyamwamu, who is the Executive Director of Future of Kenya Foundation, to speak to us.
Thank you very much for having me, and I have listened in very excellent reflections and insights, and I want to really join Naomi and all the colleagues who have spoken. And as we mark the 200th day of this genocide, I want to request that we turn our focus to the need for global reform. The reason that the United States of America, France, and the United Kingdom continue to wield this kind of power with impunity in supporting the Zionist project is because of their control of the United Nations Security Council. That is where I think if we are going to talk about long-term solutions to the situation in Palestine, we have to put the United Nations Security Council reforms on the table as an agenda now. We have to really discuss how the United Nations Security Council is going to work and what kind of measures will be taken so that genocide is not carried out with impunity. The control they have over the international institutions and organizations, including the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, comes from their control of the United Nations Security Council. That's the point I want to put on the table and demand that, request comrades that globally we now need to ramp up our efforts and advocacy to dismantle the structure of the United Nations Security Council, because that is where the legal legitimacy for supporting genocide with impunity is coming from. That is really what we can do for our Palestinian comrades today. That's the topic that I wanted to really put on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. We are now going to be joined by our last speaker, who is Ricardo Bocco, author and Emeritus Professor of Political Sociology at the Geneva Graduate Institute.
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Yes, good. Sorry, I've been missing the beginning of your debate. Actually, I was on a debate on the Swiss radio and soon on the Swiss television because today the Independent Commission on UNRWA has released the reports. This is a crucial point in the present debate because UNRWA has been accused of allegations of some of his staff being complicit in the attacks of October the 7th. And furthermore, the fact that according to Israeli authorities, some 3,000 UNRWA Palestinian staff in Gaza are members of Hamas or supporters. Now, the two reports that have been released, one by Fanny Colonna, who was the president of the commission, former French minister, and the three Scandinavian institutes, respectively Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish, they have cleared UNRWA of this accusation, actually saying that Israel has not yet substantiated their claims. There are no proofs of the implication of UNRWA staff. This is, and to make a bridge with the two topics of the debate tonight and the one on prisoners. The Israeli Defense Forces have been abducting and torturing a number of UNRWA staff in Gaza. 2 weeks ago, UNRWA has released a detailed report on those facts. Now, my point is that until when we, and I say we because I speak as a European citizen, we in the West, Europe and North America, will continue to believe to the false accusations and propaganda of the Israeli authorities. We already know that when they said that during the October 7th attack, many children have been beheaded. And then they themselves, the Israeli army, declared that this was a false information. And they keep vehiculating false information. The ones on UNRWA are particularly problematic. Of course, we know that UNRWA represents symbolically and practically an important tool of recognition of the Palestinian identity and the refugee plea from 1948 onwards. The resolution 194 of the United Nations has never been applied, meaning the right of the Palestinians to return and or of being compensated. So this was the occasion for Israel to launch a campaign. Never happened before, such a campaign against UNRWA, to the point of asking for the dismantlement of UNRWA. With quite a support from the United States so far. Several European countries have been suspending their funding. But at the end of the day, why do we have to believe to Israeli propaganda, or put in another way. Israeli authorities, their Hasbara team, their NGOs, whatever, they have the right to do their own propaganda. Fine. Now we are funding UNRWA or other agencies to defend themselves and therefore to produce reports like the two I mentioned today that have been exposed today. This costs a lot of money. Why should we bear the costs of all of that when is defamation? I think that if Israel and its allies have the right to diffuse whatever information, they have also to be considered accountable. And meaning that if once we come to results of investigative commission that contradicts what the Israeli propaganda say, they should be held accountable and brought to the court and pay the fees in terms of defamation and the cost that the organizations, the UN among others, have been bearing for defending themselves. Not to speak about, all the rest, because the destruction produced by the Israeli army in Gaza, who will pay for the reconstruction? Who? We, the taxpayers in Europe and the US, should pay for what Israel has destroyed and destroyed again? Because, by the way, many infrastructure in Gaza have been built and rebuilt with European Union money, with EU taxpayers. Sorry, we have to face this and tell our government to stop. Not to say that if we are supposed, the Europeans, be friends of Israel, we are complicit not only in the Gaza genocide, but what I foresee an Israeli collective social suicide. Because when the war in Gaza, when and how it will end, or it will stop, what will happen to the Israeli soldiers that may question what they did on the other side of the wall, on the other side of the fence? They killed and killed and killed. For what? That's all.
Thank you so much. That is extremely a somber note to end on. But before we conclude this webinar, I would just like to ask all of our panelists if anyone would like to add anything. And also we would like to invite our guests to please put forward any questions or comments that they might have in the chat. If anybody has concluding remarks, that would be great.
Can I just say something that I wish to have said if time allows? That besides using water as a weapon of this apartheid and colonization, occupation, and genocide, we also need to look at the impact, the general impact that this Israeli war is having on the entire globe, and just declare that this is not just war against Palestine, it's war against the whole planet. Because look at the amount of bombs that Israel has been throwing at Gaza, the effect that we will live with from the climate justice point of view, climate change point of view, it is an impact that all of us are going to bear. And so while they are systematically killing the Palestinians, they are also killing us and killing our planet Earth, killing our shared home. And so we should all be very, very concerned and very, very urgently concerned because they are destroying our shared home. And the protection of this shared home is a sacred responsibility. I just wish to say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On that note, if anyone does not have anything else to add, I would like to bring this panel to conclusion and extend my warmest thanks and gratitude to all of our speakers. It was an incredibly...
I have a remark, if I may.
Yes, of course.
On the last comment by Mrs. Barassa. Yeah, she's right. But see the other face of the coin. Who is gaining out of this war in Gaza and more general in the Middle East? The different military industrial complexes. First of all, in the US, the Israeli military industrial complex, Germany, the UK, Italy, France, all those countries are benefiting from the war in Ukraine and in Palestine. They've been emptying their old stocks and are making a lot of money. And they don't hide on that. The CEO of the three main armament industries in the US have openly said that they are very happy. And they began to say it in late October, November, December, how the business was growing. On top, the war on Gaza allows to experiment in the field the technology, Israeli and American. Last but not least, when we talk about money, do you know how much costed the Saturday night, not this week, but last week, when the dome in Israel repelled the Iranian missiles and drones? How much it costed that 12 hours fire? It costed $1.3 billion. $1.3 billion in 12 hours. Paid by whom? Sorry.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Welcome.
We would like to conclude actually with the recorded speech that we have from Professor Jeff Halper. Again, I thank all our panelists, and we would like to end with Professor Halper's message. I guess we're still having a bit of a technical difficulty. In just a few seconds, it will play. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I want to thank the Arab Organization for Human Rights in Britain for inviting me. Unfortunately, I'm speaking from Jerusalem and I can't make it tonight, so I'm sending this recording. Yeah, we're in more than 200 days of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. No one knows where it's exactly going to go. Israel is still committed to invading Rafah. Although I have to say that even the Israeli public is beginning to understand that this is just pointless revenge, lashing out. There's no strategy behind this genocidal campaign. There's no political purpose to it. And in fact, the goals that Israel set for itself, which was to destroy Hamas and to rescue the hostages, of course, has completely failed. Continues. Israel certainly wants to invade Rafah, and it's supported by the United States and Europe. They're not opposed to invading Rafah. They simply want cosmetically for that to happen in a way that there are as few Palestinian deaths as possible. Not as little destruction, but as few deaths. And therefore, Israel to try to move more than 1 million Palestinians to some safe place in Gaza that, of course, doesn't happen or not remains to be seen. At the same time, that our attention is focused on, the suffering in Gaza.
I think we're having a technical issue on Zoom, and seeing as it is 6:30, the recording will be available online and on YouTube. And on that note, I would just like to conclude this webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Ancia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice time. Bye-bye.